let's get going. Let me just quickly introduce an individual who needs no introduction. Jennifer Dunn, VP of Science, Chair of the Faculty, who will be introducing our postdoc flash talks.
Yes, introductions for introductions for introductions. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming here. It's great to see everybody. You're going to hear lightning talks from 4 of our postdocs today, and then another 4 tomorrow after lunch. And the first one is by Chris Kempes. His PhD is from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Physical Biology from 2013, and he joined us in 2015. So.
Thanks, Jen. One of the main questions that I think about in my research is really to ask, what are the simple principles or simple mechanisms that organize all of the diversity of life that we see? And so what I mean by this, what I mean by organize the diversity of life, is if you look at simple relationships like body size against growth rate of an organism, and this would be how fast an organism is growing over its life cycle, what we tend to see is these relationships that apply to, say, all mammals. And so this is sort of surprising, right? Because we think of mice as very different than elephants, and yet we can put them on one plot where we tend to see the commonalities. And so a deeper question here is also, if life is dealing with all of these different constraints and it has to optimize to lots of different features, how is it that we get single relationships at all? And are there ways to look at all these constraints sort of at once and still understand what's being optimized? And so one story I want to tell you about today is just a very simple example where we tried to ask the question, how much storage do mammals need, right? So how much body fat does a mammal need to optimize its survival in nature? And so here what we have is a bunch of competing interests where you have differences in growth rate, starvation rate, resource acquisition, and recovery rate, all functions of body size, and the interplay of these leads to some sort of global optimization of decreasing extinction risk. And so if we reduce this down to just 2 parameters, say the recovery rate of an organism and the starvation rate, what we see is this overall picture of extinction probability, where here you have very high extinction probability, and then you get this valley of low extinction probability, which is where all the mammals want to hang out. And yet, in this valley, not all mammals are created equally because of their size. And so we see that down at this edge is where you find things like elephants, and in the top corner is where you find mice. And in the case of mice, you see that they have sort of less flexibility to play around with these parameters and still avoid high extinction risk. And in fact, there's a point where they can't go any farther, and that tells us what the minimal size for a mammal actually should be. And it also tells us why mice can't vary all of their parameters at once. And yet elephants are in this place where they seem to have a lot of flexibility. And yet looking at their dynamics, we also find that there's an optimal large mammal size. And it's about the size of Indocutherium, which is the largest mammal we've ever seen in the fossil record. And we're able to predict this from a place where it would, due to low extinction probability, outcompete all mammals smaller and all mammals larger. And this now tells us something about the dynamics of the history of life, where we'd expect all mammals are sort of migrating to this very large size. The question being, why don't we just see this mammal of largest size? And the reason is that these are also very susceptible to large catastrophes. And so what you have is that when there aren't big catastrophes, mammals are all migrating to become larger and larger, or evolving to be larger and larger. And then catastrophes sort of push that spectrum back down. And so these are the types of principles I think about in my work applied to lots of different biological and human contexts. And for this project, I'd just like to acknowledge a few collaborators, Justin Yackel and Sid Redner. The 3 of us worked on this project together. Justin was a past and mid-year fellow at Santa Fe Institute, and Sid Redner is a current resident faculty. So with that, I'd be happy to take 1 or 2 questions, and thank you for your time.
When I look at the sort of variations of the mammals and the birds, the mammals have evolved to get bigger, but the birds have evolved to get smaller. So is that something different in the growth trajectories or a different trade-off?
Yeah, so it could be something about the differences in the allometries for growth or starvation. It also could be that the search strategies are very different. So birds have this, much higher efficiency of motility, and that might allow them to sort of search spaces in a fundamentally different way. We won't know that until we go to the full 2D context, which is what we're working on for this now, so the full spatial situation. I think That's probably all the time I have. Sorry. But yeah.
Only half the birds only search with one eye. So that would constrain.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, our next postdoc speaker is Justin Grana. He received his PhD earlier this year from American University in Washington, D.C. in economics. And he started with us actually last year as a grad student and transitioned to being a postdoc this year.
Okay. Thank you, Jen, for the introduction. As she said, I'm an econ PhD. I just finished grad school, and now I'm enjoying my time as a postdoc here at SFI. So the project that I work on, we call event-driven game theory for predicting dynamic decision makers. So what does that mean? Life is harder than chess. That's all we really need to think about. And then we can't analyze the real world with the same tools we use to analyze chess. For those of you that don't know, the tool that we would use to analyze chess is known as game theory. It's what we use to analyze interacting decision makers. Traditional game theory, for the most part, has analyzed games like chess in, dare I say, simpler versions of that. Now, what are these properties of chess that maybe make modeling real-world situations not realistic? So there's a fixed move order. White goes, black goes, white goes. We don't really need to reason about who's going to move when. The time between the moves, unless you're really good in playing with that clock, that annoying clock, is usually irrelevant. It doesn't really matter how long your opponent takes to move. And there's no unexpected random events, unless you're playing in a living room with a toddler and he's kicking over pieces randomly and you have to remember where to put him back. You don't really have to anticipate random events into the future. So what about the real world? How about a trading floor? If you meet somebody in finance that says timing doesn't matter, I would imagine they're not going to be in finance for a very long time. Real-world markets, flea markets, but you could also think of mega corporations, for example, looking at their incentives to collude when they get information and they get customers at random times and asynchronously. Also, computer networks. You can imagine, as we had that code going up earlier, computer networks are incredibly random, with random events happening when the sequence is definitely not known beforehand. So the bottom line is, chess is not the real life, is not the real world. So my goal is to extend these tools of game theory, the standard quantitative tool, to analyze interacting decision makers, to account for the importance of timing, and analyze these implications. So far we've looked at collusion among firms. How can firms that receive information at random times and not know when other firms receive their information and at what times, what is their incentive to collude, and how do they maybe not become detected? We also look to predict the behavior of malicious computer attackers. Again, a computer network is a very random event, very random environment with many interacting agents. And if we have a defender and an attacker, the timing of what the attacker does is crucial to how well the defender can detect him. And we're also looking to optimize air traffic control policies in the presence of unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs. These UAVs, the technology is not perfect yet. They go out at random times. There's communication loss, or as I said yesterday and got criticized for it, they just sometimes go bonkers. And we want to see how this uncertainty in the timing of when these UAVs might fail can impact how we optimize our air traffic control policies. Thank you. Any questions? Okay.
And of course, part of the point of these flash talks is so that you can corner some of the postdocs later to talk to them more about their work. Our third speaker is Joshua Garland. He received his PhD in 2016 from the University of Colorado in computer science. And so he has just been with us for a couple of months.
So while I got my PhD in computer science, I actually started my academic career as a mathematician. And when I was a mathematician, I was really lucky that I just got to assume I had anything I wanted, and then I could prove fantastic things. So I could say, assume I had an infinitely long time series, then I could go on to prove these great things. But as I transitioned to be a complexity scientist, my world changed. And now instead of assuming I have all the data I want in the world, now I have 300 noisy observations that someone collected while freezing in the Antarctic. And what they want to know is that, what can we learn from this? oftentimes the mathematical models and theories I learned were too strenuous to apply to this data, but is there still interesting information contained within this data? And so some of the things I think about are, does the collected data actually inform us about the system? What information, if any, can be extracted from this data? And do the observations tell us something about the future? And so what I'd like to do now is talk about one of the many systems I think about on a daily basis, and those are paleoclimate records. So what these records are is they'll go down to Antarctica or they'll go up to Greenland, and they'll take these massive ice rods that are 3 to 5 kilometers long. And what they believe is that contained within these ice is a lot of information about the past and the future climate system that needs to be unlocked. So they believe it has a lot of information content. But one thing I'm interested in understanding is exactly what information is contained in these records. So what they'll do is they'll translate this big rod of ice into a time series, into a kind of orient you on this plot. The x-axis is time in thousands of years before present. The far right side is the past, and the left side is the present. So the right-hand side is 120,000 years ago, and the left-hand side is the present day. And then the red curve is just a temperature proxy for the climate. And what you can see is there's these interesting features that pop out automatically. For example, like there's these massive spikes. And during one of these massive spikes, there's actually a 16 centigrade increase in the overall Earth's temperature. It's a massive increase in the Earth's temperature. And then it takes about 1,000 years for this to calm down. And these are kind of the poster child for abrupt warming. So they look at these as something that, what's triggering these events? They think, when we talk to climate scientists about this, they think it's all this new information being injected in the climate. Something came in from outside, kicked the climate, caused this massive abrupt warming, and then the climate had to auto-correct itself. So what I can do as an information theorist is I can actually look at the amount of new information in this time series to see if it actually is new information. So the black curve here measures how much new information unrelated to the past is in each observation. To have a concrete example of this, there's this little bump right here. So the black curve is going along steadily, and then all of a sudden there's a spike. And so what happened there was the Toba super eruption. So this was a volcano that was so big, it caused a winter for 10 years and 1,000 years of cooling for the climate. So if you're going along being in the climate in the region before the bump, you couldn't have predicted that that occurred. It's this new event that occurred. And then eventually that information got worked out of the climate. What's most disturbing about this plot is during the DO events, during these abrupt warming events, there's no new information. This has massive implications for the way that we analyze paleoclimate records. It may not be that these are some exogenous event. It may be actually that they're part of the climate system. It's normal for the climate to warm and then cool itself. And understanding this has big implications. I like to look at one other just kind of fun example. This is a different core. This one's actually from Greenland as opposed to Antarctica. I did the same thing where I looked at the amount of information per observation in the data. And what you see right away is this massive spike. So that's way bigger than even like a super volcano that almost destroyed the Earth, right? And so I went back and the data looks fine. And there doesn't appear to be any kind of weird errors. I went back, there's no big volcanoes that occurred there. So I brought it to my collaborators at Instar and I said, what's going on here? And the director of the institute got kind of white and he started looking at the postdocs. And he said, well, what happened then was our machine broke. And so we started using the old equipment. The data looked fine. So we just kept going. And then we got the new equipment back. And he said, well, this is horrible. We're going to have to reanalyze everything. And then he said, well, wait a second. What are these other bumps? And then he sent off a flock of graduate students to reanalyze all the data. And so, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joshua. Our final speaker for the postdocs for today is Liz Hobson, who received her PhD in biology in 2013 from New Mexico State University, so in-state. And she started with us this year, just again, a couple of months ago.
Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work with animal sociality today. And sociality and animal social structure is important to understand because animals gain a lot of benefits from associating with a group of other conspecifics, individuals of their same species. But they also pay a lot of costs in terms of competing with those same group members. And so social structure is one way that animals can balance the costs and benefits of associating with their social group. And one of the common costs is fighting over resources or fighting to establish dominance rank in a system. And so you can see here, these are all examples of species that will fight within their groups to establish a dominance rank. So you can see it's incredibly widespread across the animal kingdom. And even humans will compete to establish rank in some systems. And we actually even have a cautionary phrase about that: choose your battles wisely. And this really gets at the intuitive link between the underlying cognition that's underlying the decisions about, for example, when to attack a certain individual or who to fight with. And so because there seems to be this, in some systems, a fundamental link between the sociality and the underlying cognitive skills, I spent a lot of time watching animals fight. So in particular, I worked a lot with parrots. And so here you can see two individuals are fighting with one another. So what I do is map all of those fights onto a group level dominance hierarchy, which you can see here. And then from that, I can quantify things like an individual's rank in the dominance hierarchy or the strength of those interactions. But I use what we consider to be pretty cognitively demanding methods. And we don't necessarily expect animals themselves to be using the same methods and mental math to come up with an idea of their own rank. So a really critical question to answer is, so I can detect these structures, but what do the animals themselves actually know about their social worlds? And how did they detect that knowledge and form that social knowledge that they can then use to be more strategic in who they're fighting with? So I focus on three main questions in my research. The first, at a basic level, is how and why individuals interact. And to answer that, I do a combination of data collection and social network analysis to understand the strengths of the patterns of interactions among individuals. Then I also ask, at a larger level, what kinds of social knowledge can individuals potentially synthesize from these patterns of interactions? So here I use computational models to try to piece apart where we see these deviations of behaviors that are deviating from basic rules in the social system that may be indicative of social strategies that are based on this knowledge. Finally, I use comparative analyses across multiple species to understand better how these sociocognitive abilities evolved. And so, for example, in the parakeets, what I found is that individuals are interacting. One of the ways that they interact is through fighting with each other. And the purpose of those fights is to establish a rank in the dominance hierarchy, which they do very quickly in new groups. I also found that individuals can develop knowledge about their own rank in the dominance hierarchy and the rank of others in their group, and they can use that information to be strategic about who they're choosing to fight with. Finally, I started looking at what I found in the parrots and then trying to start to compare to what we see in other species, such as primates. But to truly get at the origin and the evolution of these sociocognitive abilities, I needed to broaden my species focus and look at a lot more species. And that's just what I've been doing since I joined SFI. So since I've come here, I've looked at how and why individuals of different species interact by applying the same tools that I use with the parrots. And so here you can see a network of interactions among communities of a small forest bird. I'm also looking at how social knowledge can be synthesized by people. So here you can see students participating in a networked computer game where they're virtually fighting with one another. And then we look at how their strategies for developing rank in a dominance hierarchy shift based on the differences in social knowledge that they can synthesize. And finally, on a very broad scale level, I'm looking at how these sociocognitive abilities evolved by looking across the animal kingdom in over 50 species that fight to establish rank in a dominance hierarchy, to understand how both cognitive skills and social knowledge are distributed across the animal kingdom. And the ultimate goal of this research is to better understand how social complexity or social decisions are linked with underlying cognitive skills, and how both of these aspects may have originated and evolved. Thanks. Yep.
How do parents decide who to fight?
So it seems to be a little bit of a brawl in the beginning, and then as the winners become winners and the losers become losers, then they start to establish some rudimentary rank. And then what happens is that individuals are attacking their closest competitors. So individuals that are ranked below themselves, but only slightly below. So this kind of social strategy emerges very quickly.
Because I guess I would have imagined that they would have seen fighting ability, but that possibly you might have discovered some second dimension. Presumably there's a partial order on sort of who fights.
Yeah, so interestingly, so there's not a visual cue to the potential for winning these fights. So there's no correlation between like the size of a bird and its ability to gain a high rank. So we think it's all based on watching the outcomes of these events and processing it in some way. Did I have one over here somewhere? Sorry.
Right over there. Go ahead.
Are the birds on the low end of the pecking order picked on by the other birds?
So that's interesting. So they're only picked on by the individuals that are ranked slightly above them. So these very low-ranked birds are largely ignored by the top-ranked birds in the system. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. You'll hear from 4 more tomorrow.